Well, I think we can start now, or we can start at least with the introductions as we wait for more people to join the room. We have a very large group today, and I want to start by saying welcome to Mexican Muralists in China, a presentation by Zheng Shengtian and Marisol Villela Balderrama on the understudied impact of Mexican art and artists on the development of art in China in the 20th century. My name is Jane Debevoise, and I'm the chair of Asia Art Archive in New York and Hong Kong. Asia Art Archive, as many of you know, is a Brooklyn-based mini hub of Asia Art Archive in Asia Art Archive in America is a Brooklyn-based mini hub of Asia Art Archive in Hong Kong. And in both New York and in Hong Kong, we are nonprofit libraries, digital archives, and platforms for research, discussion, and debate focused on what we call recent art from Asia. We also have a series of public programs that we do, like today's program. And we are delighted to be celebrating International Archives Day today, and perhaps many of you did not know that, but it is International Archives Day, and these presentations, which you will be about to see, are overflowing with archival material. Now, first, we have a lot to cover today, and it's a very, very rich assembly of materials. We want to leave time for Q&A, but first I'm going to introduce the speakers. Zheng Shengtian is the first person I will be introducing today. Many of you know him. He is an artist, a scholar, a curator. He is based in Vancouver, Canada, which is where he will be speaking from today. He is the managing editor of Issue, Journal of Contemporary Chinese Art, the adjunct director of the Institute of Asian Art at the Vancouver Art Gallery, a research fellow at Simon Fraser University, and a member of the board of directors of Asia Art Archive in America. Related to the program that he will be, we have today, he recently curated the 2018 exhibition, Winds from Fusang, Mexico and China in the 20th Century, that toured to the USC Pacific Asia Museum in Pasadena and the Diego Rivera Mural Museum in Mexico City. And I just want to say that Asia Art Archive is honored to have been working with Zheng as a very close advisor, but also on digitizing his large and growing collection of primary materials, archival materials, for the last 10 years. Much of which is online on our website, and we're going to put the link to his digital archive, or the archive that we have digitized, although there's much more to go, in the chat. Marisol Villela Balderrama is a Mexican art historian whose research focuses on public art and the artistic connections between China and Latin America during the Cold War. She obtained a Chinese government scholarship and lived in China from 2013 to 2017, where she received her master's degree from the China Academy of Art in Hangzhou. That is where Zheng Shengtian studied and graduated and taught for many years, I think as much as 30 years. Her MA thesis and research was a crucial contribution to the exhibitions, Winds from Fusang, the one I just talked about that Zheng Shengtian curated. She is currently a PhD student in the Department of Art History and Architecture at the University of Pittsburgh. She's speaking from Pittsburgh today. Now, today's program is divided into 4 parts. First, we'll watch a short video, a short documentary film about the 1956 exhibition that first brought Mexican artists to China. It was produced for Winds of Fusang, Mexico and China in the 20th Century, presented by USC Pacific Asia Museum, edited by Alvaro Parra. We'll put links to that video also in the chat, but we're going to watch it today. Second, Professor Zheng will speak for about 20 minutes. Marisol will speak for another 20 minutes. And then we hope to have a 15 to 20 minute Q&A. But before we start the video and hear from our speakers, I just want to say that we have roughly 1 hour for 1 hour for the whole project, but it's roughly 1 hour. We'll see how that goes. Please submit your questions in the Q&A box, as I'm sure everybody's familiar to do it, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. We won't be able to get to all of them. This event is recorded, so if you want to revisit it or assign it to your students, colleagues, will be posted on our website in a few days. We're also live streaming from Facebook, so if you're watching from that platform, feel free to comment on the live video, and we have colleagues who will relay the questions to us. So without further ado, let's tune into the short video, which again talks about the seminal 1956 exhibition in China, and then Professor Zheng will begin his talk. Thank you very much.
1956年，墨西哥艺术阵线有一个应该有一定规模的一个展览。那时候是我在中央美术学院副总图书。这个展出的作品呢，其中包括西盖洛斯的作品，包括里维拉的作品，都有，还有其他很多艺术家的作品。
我到学校的时候，刚到学校不久，就有一个大型的墨西哥绘画展。哎呀，我当时看了很兴奋。
一开始呢，我就觉得这个，因为当时都是学苏联的艺术，这个对墨西哥的艺术并不是很熟悉，不太了解。那么看了这个以后呢，还是觉得很震动，印象很深刻。到我现在闭起眼睛来，有些主要的作品摆的位置我都能回忆，就是这些作品。
但是这个少年艺术展呢，会有两件作品是引起观众注意最多，争论最多。一张就是几个老师的我们解释的面貌，一个石头人，那个就是我们解释的面貌。这张作品啊，在当时议论的最多。但是西方的表现方法跟中国不一样，中国那时候一定是表现社会主义、现实主义，就是要用写实的手法大家易于了解的这种抽象的这种开关性，大家看不懂。我们就提出这个问题，问他这个把这幅作品的依据何在？他就说是这幅作品，我就是表现墨西哥目前的老百姓的状态。墨西哥的人民已经是没有自主权，没有自己的头脑不控制于自己了，像石头一般的麻木。他是这个意思。是表示的是墨西哥在那个反动政府的扎压下，人民得不到自由，思想得不到自由。 还有一件就是里维拉的这个光荣的胜利。
对。
Cuando yo regreso de Guatemala, encuentro que Diego Rivera estaba pintando un mural sobre la Revolución Guatemalteca, porque Frida se había impresionado tanto que murió una semana después de la caída de Guatemala. Y entonces, como yo acababa de estar allá y había vivido todo ese momento, me pide Diego Rivera que yo le platique cómo estuvo todo y que le ayude en ese mural que se llama La Gloriosa Victoria. Entonces trabajo en La Gloriosa Victoria y ese cuadro fue uno de los que el Frente Nacional de Artes Plásticas mandó a Europa al viaje y que después estuvieron viajando por China, ¿no?
Esta exposición recorrió Alemania, recorrió Polonia, varios países del bloque socialista y después pasó a China. En México yo formé parte de un grupo de personas, no solo pintores, sino una sociedad de amigos de China. Es decir, la idea era que hubiera relaciones diplomáticas entre México y China. Todavía no existían relaciones diplomáticas. Una organización de pintores mexicanos realizó una exposición de pintura y de obra gráfica. La obra gráfica provenía principalmente del taller de gráfica popular. Y pues yo era miembro ya del taller de gráfica popular.
我觉得这个时候，墨西哥给我的一个什么感受呢？就是，我觉得那些墨西哥的画家，他本身是革命家，同时是艺术家，所以他不管用什么语言，他是在真实地表达他的感受，表达他的思想和情感。而我们的画家呢，是根据党的政策的需要，来搞一种革命艺术。这两回事儿，这两个东西是不一样的。所以我觉得他们呢，因为他的最根本的这一点上，他是真诚的，因为他是很有理想的，而且他们自己就是革命家，像西格洛斯，他是墨西哥共产党的总书记。
这个苏联艺术在一统天下的时候，因为往西方走是不允许走， 就因为西方的是认为是资产阶级的，特别是西方的现代派，就是在那些年代，墨西哥的艺术呢，它相对的能够接受，就说是它是以革命，应该是它的内容是墨西哥的民主革命，而且崇拜他们，除了他们的艺术以外，也崇拜他们的为人，就说他们这个是一方面是革命家，是军人，哎，你像西盖罗斯在参加西班牙内战是一个少校，哎，又是一个艺术家，就是说一只手拿着枪，一只手拿着笔。
Hello, welcome to this talk. And I remember 10 years ago, I was invited by Professor Lachman at Columbia University to give a talk on the same subject for his graduate students. Now 10 years passed. I don't remember how many lectures I give in different occasions, but finally we put up a show about this part of history, and there was an exhibit at the Pacific Asia Museum in Pasadena, California, and also in Diego Rivera Museum, Mural Museum in Mexico City 2 years ago. So today we have a very limited time. I want to say too much about the history itself. Maybe just very briefly give you some information, but mainly I will talk about my own experience, my connection with Mexican art. Let us start with the slides. Can you move to, yes. You just saw an exhibition in 1956 held in Beijing, which toured to Shanghai later in October, then to Guangzhou in November. At that time, I was a student. I was studying Hangzhou Academy, Zhejiang Academy of Fine Arts. Now it's called China Academy of Art. I was 18 years old. I was at the third year in the academy. And then we learned that there is a huge Mexican art show in Shanghai. It moved from Beijing, they moved to Shanghai. So we were able to all take a tour to Shanghai to see the show. At that time, it was a very slow train from Hangzhou to Shanghai. It took 5 hours. And I think most of my schoolmates and the faculty members all went to Shanghai because in China, there was very rare opportunity to see original artwork, especially, in 1950s, China was mostly closed to outside. So we didn't have any chance to travel. And you go to Paris, go to Rome, go to New York like today. You can see original work. But when we were studying in China at that time, you only can look at very poorly printed some publications. there's no chance to see original work. So every time we learn there's a art show coming from outside, we will make every effort to go to see it, especially like this Mexican show, which is pretty large. They have like 200, more than 200 oil paintings, and another 300 more prints. So it's quite size during that time even. The show was displayed at the Shanghai Exhibition Hall, Shanghai 展览馆. At that time was we called the 中苏友好大厦. It's a beautiful and huge exhibition from Soviet Union in 1955. So it's kind of a Stalin style large building, which have a very tall tower in the middle, and then two wings on the side. And now it's still the same structure. If you go to Shanghai, if you attend the Shanghai, the Contemporary Art Fair or other event, you will see the same building as we saw half century ago. But it was very strong memory to, many of my colleagues, my schoolmates, because not only the size of the show, but the quality of the show. You have to understand that at that time, China was dominated by the Russian Soviet style of socialist realism. After 1949, the socialist realism was introduced to China from Russia. Then all the art academies have to take this system called the Chischakov system as a basic training courses. So everyone has to learn how to draw, like there's a very realistic style drawing. I remember, because the Hangzhou Academy had the long time influence from France, because many of the faculty members were studied in Paris or Belgium in 1930s, even 40. But in 1950s, all those teachers left the school. And we had the Russian trained teacher, and also even the Russian artists come to China to teach. But like this Chischakov system, they ask a student to use pencil to do the drawing instead of a charcoal. We used to do charcoal, like you can do a sketch in a few minutes, or the longest maybe a few hours. But this system from Russia, they require you to use a pencil to do a very detailed drawing. It would take like 3 weeks to finish one drawing. But that's the system we are forced to learn, which is not bad, actually. It gives the student a very good, very solid training of how to control the form, the proportion, all these basic rules. Actually, at that time, I very much enjoyed, learning the art from Soviet Union. But I have a question: is that how could we paint China use the same kind of style? I think that we many of my colleagues, we believe that was not possible, because our life, our environment, or feeling is not the same as the artists in Russia. So you have to find something in your way to express yourself. So at this time, we saw this exhibition from Mexico. When we didn't have any chance to see modern art from Europe, from United States. So this is a kind of a very shocking experience to see the artwork not only like have a realistic style, but also there's many work with influenced by Cubism, by symbolism, by futurism, all this influence from the modern movement. So there was very kind of a eye-opening exhibition for the students. That's why I think 1956 was kind of a turning point in the Chinese art history, because you have to understand that the same year Mao gave a talk about that there's 100 flowers blossom, new policy of the open the country. It was just after Khrushchev like changed policy in Soviet Union, and the China at that time also kind of open a little bit, after a few years from 1949. So there's a more debate on cultural and art policies, and the more style or new artwork were exhibited. Next slide. So I will briefly tell you the history of how Mexican art was introduced into China. The earliest time is 1931, when Lu Xun, the famous writer, introduced Diego Rivera in this magazine called the Beidou. Actually, Lu Xun had a book of Diego Rivera, which was publishing in Germany. At that time, Lu Xun had a friend and a student in Heidelberg, studying in Germany. And he worked as an agent for Lu Xun to buy prints, original art prints like Kitty Korowitz and other, European artists. But I also bought this Diego Rivera's book for Lu Xun. I think Lu Xun reproduced the image from this book. So this is the one, the first mural was introduced to China. The second one. Yeah, also there was a journal in 1933, 文学 literature, which reproduced two images from the same project, the Diego Rivera's mural from the Ministry of Public Education. So these two, Foundry and the Weavers, was in the magazine, but it's a black and white, it's not colored. Next, please. And then 1938, 文艺正地, another magazine, published, reproduced Orosco's lithography. This is Sabatistas. So we see gradually, in those years, those Mexican artwork start to introduce into China through the literature publication. Next, please. And there's another one in 1934, Lin Yutang, a writer. He wrote a very short essay, 说漫画, on caricature. and they introduced Covarrubias, Miguel Covarrubias drawing. This is a soldier, women soldiers in the revolution. Actually, Covarrubias was the first artist, Mexican artist, to come to visit China. Next. In 1930s, Covarrubias worked in New York. He was the art director of Vanity Fair, the fashion magazine. For 10 years, he was working there. And he got a scholarship from a grant from Guggenheim Foundation to travel to Indonesia, to Bali, to study the folk art, music, and dance. So he traveled to Indonesia with his wife, Rosa Rolanda. At that time, they had to take this, travel by ocean. So a very long trip on the ship, and they have to stop in Tokyo, in Shanghai, in Hong Kong, all this port. So he had twice a stop in Shanghai, and one trip, especially in 1933, was very well recorded. How he met Chinese artists. He lived first was hosted by this woman, an American writer, Bernadine Fritz. That's her residence in Shanghai. Now, just last year, I think they opened as a kind of a exhibition center. People could to go and visit. Before that, there was an office, a government office. When I went to Shanghai, I only could take a picture, but I was not able to get into this building where Covarrubias used to stay for a short time. Next. And even his visit was very brief. He did go to different cities like Suzhou and Beijing and Guangzhou and Hong Kong, but his short stay had tremendous influence on Chinese artists, especially in Shanghai, because in Shanghai he met a publisher, Shao Junmei, a writer also. Shao Junmei published several magazines, literature magazine or those pictorial, cartoon magazine. And Shao Junmei had a group of artists working for him for those magazines. And so he introduced Covarrubias to meet those young artists. And those artists already saw Covarrubias' work from Vanity Fair or other magazines before his arrival. But so when they had a chance to meet a real artist, they get very excited. So many artists actually, in their memoir, in their writing, they all mentioned how much influence they got from Covarrubias. So one of our artists is Zhang Guangyu. Now, Zhang Guangyu is considered the father of Chinese modern design and animation. Last year, there was a huge exhibition in Beijing in Guardian Art Center about Zhang Guangyu. But his early work was very much influenced by Covarrubias. Actually, he learned a lot from his technique, his decorative style. And they both like antiques. From Shao Junmei's writing, Zhang Guangyu took Covarrubias to the antique market in Shanghai. They both like jade or some other little crafts. And another artist is next, please, Ye Qianyu. Also at that time, a very young, ambitious artist. And Ye Chenyu, in his memoir, said, and said this many times in different occasions, say he was, Covarrubias like changed his life, because before Covarrubias, he met Covarrubias, he only, he never did sketching. He always take a camera, take a picture. But when he was with Covarrubias, they went to Suzhou together. He recalled that he always see Covarrubias carry a sketchbook. And also he was told that you should always sketching on the site. So that will help you, become a good artist. So he take that advice from Covarrubias, and he said that change. This is like a very important transformation since my art career began. So actually, Ye Chenyu then become the most important sketching artist in China. And he published a lot of books of a sketch. In our show of Wind from Fusang, we are able to borrow some of these early sketches in 1940s. Next, please. And then after the People's Republic of China established, of course, China opened its door to some left-wing intellectuals from Europe and America. In 1952, in Beijing, there was a huge, very large, the first large-size international conference in Beijing called the Peace Conference for Asian and the Pacific regions. It was during the war, the Korean War. China need to have support from the rest of the world. So they organized with the help from peace movement in Europe. They hold this meeting in Beijing. And at the same time, actually, Diego Rivera was one of the founding members of this conference, but he didn't come. He didn't come to Beijing, but he sent this reproduction of this very large painting he made in 1952 to Beijing. And there's a long story about this painting. We don't have time to talk. You can check online. But anyway, the original work, which is huge, is like 10 meters long. Now it's only, we can see the drawing in Mexico City. But the original painting was missing. It was told that Rivera give it to China or sold it to China for $5,000. But nobody really find any trace of about this painting. But we did find the information about reproduction was brought to China in 1952 when the Mexican delegates come to Beijing. After they arrived from the airplane, immediately they took this, you see this roll in this picture, they took this large reproduction of that painting, Nightmare of War, Dream of Peace, to show it to Chinese friends who come to welcome the delegates. And the next day, the painting was hung in the meeting hall, facing Picasso's another huge drawing of peace, of peace. So in this conference, there was two artworks actually facing each other. Unfortunately, we couldn't find any photo of the conference hall. There was a picture of Picasso stove, but they didn't have a Diego Rivera's mural. But we had reports from magazine and from the delegates who attended the conference. They did see the painting hanging wall and had record on that. Next, please. So after this conference, actually, there was even besides Mexican delegates, also there's other artists like from Chile, from Colombia, come to the conference. So after the conference in November, there was an exhibition called the Latin American artists who participating in the peace conference held in Beijing during after the conference with more than 150 works. This exhibition, some of the works were given to China as a gift, but also after Cultural Revolution, we couldn't find anything left. I only have a record of it, including a very large oil painting made by this Alipio Jaramillo in Beijing. He made that oil painting in Beijing and gave to the Chinese History Museum, but now the work is also missing. Next, please. So now we go back to 1956. 1956 was a year of Mexican art. Like there are so many, two major art shows in Beijing. One is the print exhibition was held in Beijing in March 1956. Another show was in August. And both exhibitions have catalogs and the books. Here are some of the publication in 1956 and also 1957. After 1 year, is still published like this book and this book. But altogether, there was 5 publications, and also there's many media reports. So Mexican art was really a kind of a highlight of that year's cultural activities. Next, please. In addition of the exhibition, then we had a very important visitor, which is David Segarras. Segarras come to China during that show. And at that time, he was one of the leaders of Mexican Communist Party. So he was well received in Beijing, and he met Zhou Enlai and has a long talk with Zhou Enlai. And then after that with Zhou Yang, the Minister of Propaganda. And in Beijing, they published his talk and also his open letter to Soviet painters, which in the letter, actually, he criticized the Soviet art and asked the Chinese art not to follow their footsteps, but to learn from your own tradition, to create a new art of the era. So we all listened this, not only saw the Mexican art, but then we listened the talk, like even not directly listen to him. I didn't have a chance because at that time I was a student, but our teacher went there, and you learn from other artists, because his talk was very powerful and also was so different with what we learned from the authority. So it's almost like a revolutionary kind of a speech to us. Next, please. And I can give you examples like one of the artists, Yuan Yunsheng, you saw it in the video. And he was really impressed by Mexican art, especially Figueroa and Diego Rivera. And so he changed his mind. He didn't want to learn from Soviet art. And he used his own style, created this work for his graduation project. Of course, it was criticized. He was criticized. And he was labored the rightist. He was sent to the countryside. And this painting lost. But someone find it later on and saved it. So last year in Beijing, there was a large exhibition of this recovered painting. Conservation company spent 3 years to repair this painting. But now Yuan Yunsheng donated to Central Academy of Fine Art and with hundreds of sketches and documentations. So there was a very interesting show about this history, how the artist, just because he's tried to use his own style or a different style and was punished, and the painting was totally lost. Actually, I studied at the same studio as the Yuan Yunsheng. I was a little bit late, later in 1962 and 63. Next, please. So you can see I also influenced by Mexican art. I will try to get away from the Soviet realist, the socialist realist style. And this is some interesting documents from my archive. There's one drawing of me. And I remember still in the classroom when we students were very excited about Mexican art, talking about Mexican art. And someone draw my portrait, a cartoon portrait of myself. And then wrote, say, Viva Rivera, like long life Rivera. And it's showing that time how, the students were excited about this, the art they saw from Mexico. And also you can see from my work, it was influenced by Mexican art. So we tried to use a different style. Even the portrait, I use the plants like from Mexico as the background. This is a drawing and kind of a composition I did in Inner Mongolia after I visit Inner Mongolia for a couple of times for like sketching and doing some work there. Next. And I did a painting for the national exhibition called Home in the Grassland in 1964. So in this painting, I tried to use the technique I learned from Mexican artists and the idea of how to portray the people in their own lifestyle. So this is a kind of a thing in Mongolia in their costume and the life. They're all, I try to find the color and the position to like depicted this kind of life, very different with the art we saw, like the painting we saw from the Soviet Union. But the painting, when it was exhibiting in Beijing in the national show, it was criticized. Someone reported to the authority, say this artist had the wrong idea and we should remove this painting. And after the show, the painting get lost, never see it back to me. So this is the last year when we had this COVID-19 closing time. I remade this in my studio, just not exactly the same, but the idea, and wrote about the history of my lost paintings. So I called the lost painting number 2, this 1964, to recall this the story. Next, please. Yeah, in 1982, I went to Mexico first time when I was in the United States as a visiting scholar. So I met with those Mexican artists. I did some paintings. So that reconnected me with Mexico after the Cultural Revolution. Since then, I started to do the research about this exchange, cultural exchange. So I find those material from 1930s, 1950s, and until later after Cultural Revolution, when the Chinese, the new mural movement started and in Beijing airport. So then I was able to put them all together and to organize an exhibition called The Wind from Fusang. Fusang is the name in the Chinese legend about this area east of China. And some scholars didn't agree this. They thought, they say this is Fusang is Japan, but many other scholars say Fusang is Mexico. So we take it still, many writers use it as a kind of a literary name for Mexico. We found that that's interesting to have this name. So I curated with Christina Yu, the director at that time of Pacific Asia Museum. We had this show, next please. We had this exhibition in first in Pacific Asia Museum, then tour to Mexico City in Diego Rivera Museum in 2018. So I was very happy to bring this story back to Mexico, to let Mexico people, artists, friends, they know how we appreciate their art, how their art influenced us. Not only my generation, but some younger artists, the generation that follows. I'm glad that in Mexico, the show was very well received. You can see the opening, we even have a dragon dance. And also they published a very good catalog, Spanish language catalog. So now we hope this exhibition after this pandemic, we may able to bring it back to China. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being right now with us. I am very happy to be here. Thank you, Jane, for the invitation for this event, for participating in this event. Hillary and all the staff on Asian Art Archive in America, behind the scenes that are helping us with creating this event. I am very happy to be here, as I said, and also I recognize that I have a huge privilege of having a work that I enjoy and that I am passionate about, and that I think that this privilege is also connected with other people not being as privileged as I am around the world. I started to learn about this topic that we're talking about now. Thank you, Professor Zheng, for all what you shared today with us. I started to learn it from him in 2016. And I was a grad student in China Academy of Art in Hangzhou. Right away, I became fascinated by this story of other Mexicans and other Mexican artists that travel also to China the way I did it, but about half a century before I did. And I had a big question too, that is like, why this history hasn't been really told, or why it's not that well known. And this question is one that drives my work forward, and then expanded towards other parts of Latin America too, in connection with Asia. And well, what I'm gonna share with you today is a part of the research that I did also for this exhibition that Professor Zheng was talking about, and for my master's thesis in China. I will continue in this very important year that we have been talking about, 1956. And on screen now, you can see a list of the artists that we have found out that traveled to China, Mexican artists that traveled to China during the 1950s and 60s. Professor Zheng already talked about Ignacio Aguirre, Javier Guerrero a little bit, and David Alfaro Siqueiros. I will continue in this year. And on the left, we see a painting by Celia Calderon titled Chinese Girls. And to the right is a black and white reproduction of an old painting by Mario Orozco Rivera. He's the son of a Mexican contemporary artist. So he's the father of Mexican contemporary artist Gabriel Orozco. And these paintings were made in Mexico after the two of them traveled separately to China during these decades. So similarly to what we're talking before, they were sketching a lot while traveling in China. Next slide, please. But before going into the very, very short account of these travels of Mexican artists, I wanted to introduce very briefly another important character in this story. This is the Chilean artist, Jose Venturelli. Some of you might know him. He was crucial in making all this connection happen. And he, although he was Chilean, he learned about Mexican muralist tradition and techniques and process from David Alfaro Siqueiros. And on the right, we can see Angelica Arenal, his wife, Siqueiros, then Venturelli, and then Alivio Jaramillo, that it's the second time that he comes in the story again. So they all worked together in Chile in the beginnings of the 40s. And that's how they became friends. And then also that's how Venturelli later invited Siqueiros and also suggested that the exhibition of Mexican art travel from the West Soviet bloc all the way to China. So thank you, Venturelli, for making all these connections. And also I want to thank the family of Jose Venturelli, because they have helped a lot in doing this research. And to the left, we see again, Jose Venturelli. It's really easy to spot him usually on pictures because he's the tallest, usually the tallest of the people depicted or that appear. And on the background, we see his mural that he created in 1952, right after he moved to China to help organizing this conference that Professor Zheng was talking about for the Pacific and for the Asian Pacific regions to promote the peace movement. He created this large-scale painting, mural size, we will say, for the headquarters of the peace movement. And sadly, as many other artworks that we have been talking about, went missing or it was destroyed at some point. Next slide, please. So it was through Venturelli and also specific groups or institutions in Latin America that these connections were happening. I think what I'm sharing right now is more like the other side of the story from what we heard before. It's more about how people reach all the way to China and how they were perceiving China as a source of inspiration too. And so on screen, we see on the left two posters done by artist Fanny Ravel that were used to promote events organized by the Mexican Society of Friends with the People's China. This society was composed by not only by artists, but also other intellectuals and professionals in Mexico. They were trying to convince the government or support the reestablishment of diplomatic relations between China and between Mexico and the People's Republic of China that had been like broken after 1949. And to the right, we see photograph of a performance, the dance performance created by Rocío Sagaón, the second wife of Miguel Covarrubias that we already mentioned too. And she didn't visit China. And I think many of these people didn't go to China during their lifetimes, but they were supporting with activities. There were like film screenings, lectures happening, and they just continue pushing this idea of the recognition of China, of the PRC. Next slide, please. So in addition to that Friendship Society, there were other three main groups that were mostly about art, like plastic art. And to the left, we have an image by the Taller de Gráfica Popular, the People's Print Workshop, that was published that was done in 1950 to celebrate the first anniversary of October 1st. And they were actively supporting the establishment of the beginning of a communist country in other parts of the world. And in the middle, we have another image that we already talked about, the one of the catalogs for the exhibition of 1956. And to the right, it's an exhibition about Chinese painting that was organized by the Hall of Mexican Plastic Art. And most of the artists that traveled to China were part of this group of Hall of Mexican Plastic Art, which is still open or still ongoing in Mexico City. Next slide, please. So we have seen this painting again. We see it here, and David Alfaro Siqueiros, the image of the current man. As we talked before, it was a very controversial image, and including Joe and I did not agree with the image of man being depicted this way in the exhibition of the Mexican art show. But then I think it's also important to think about how Siqueiros was connected to China before he actually went to China that year of 1956. And one of the evidence of how he knew about China, or he was aware of the developments, historical things that were happening there, is this artwork that is at the MoMA right now, and that it's one of its original subtitles was a proletariat victim in contemporary China. He was aware of the war, what was happening there, and denounced it. How did he get information or images about it? That's also a good question. And one possible answer, can we have this next slide, please, is through printed media. Here is another example of how he saw images of the violence happening in China. This is a newspaper clip from Life magazine and an article from 1941 that Siqueiros used for his composition of one of the murals in Mexico City at the Palace of Fine Arts, and then we can also see how he used it as a marker as a palette, we'll say, to make scholars. Slide. And I'll go very quickly over this because we already covered it. So before Siqueiros arrived to China in 1956, he had already published this open letter to the Soviet painters, and it was published in Mexico and not in the Soviet Union at the time, of course. But I think it's important to know that at that time, when he arrived to China in 1956, invited by Venturelli, he already had this doubts about the art that was happening in the Soviet Union or that was promoted there. He had like traveled there at least 3 times before, and he was criticizing how he didn't see a real development on their style, but more just like a perfectionism in their technique. And as we saw, like this is the idea these are the ideas that he was talking about in his public talks in China and in other parts of the world when he was addressing the topic of public art. Next slide. So here, yes, he met with Zhou and Lai, as we saw, and also with many other like painters and saw some parts of China too. Next slide. Sorry, this is, I don't want to go through the same, so we'll just continue. Thank you. And then I think it's also relevant to notice that beyond Siqueiros or Diego Rivera or other big figures that are better known, other Mexican artists traveled to China. And there is again the list of all of them, the ones that we know that traveled before the Cultural Revolution. And I think it's surprising if we compare with other situations that many of them are women. Most in this list, the majority are women, and it's a rare case that I think we talk more about this. And we see here also no, can we go to the previous one? Thank you. And we see the catalog for one of the exhibitions that Mario Orozco Rivera had after he came back from China, and after spending 45 days touring all around China in different parts. So every story of these artists, of each of these artists, is different, and how they arrived to China is never it was never on a direct flight, and it was very seldom with a direct invitation from the Chinese artists or Chinese authorities. It is interesting to discover all these triangulations or different ways of getting to China. In the case of Mario Orozco Rivera, he first attended a youth festival of the peace movement in Moscow, and while they were there, he was also there was also a group of Mexican dancers of the, I think it was a ballet Zapata that I heard on the questions someone asked about this, and then the Chinese delegation that attended this event in Moscow was very interested about, or was very attracted to this dancing performance. So they invited them to travel to China, and they needed musicians. So there were not enough musicians, and Orozco Rivera traveled as a musician and a singer, but not as a painter officially. But it was a chance for him to tour around and see different parts and create a lot of sketches. Next slide, please. So as I was saying, there was no direct flight. Like right now, we can take a flight from Mexico City, Tijuana, Beijing, or Shanghai. That possibility was not available back then. So at least this idea of like the trans-Pacific connections during this part of the 20th century, it could be very poetic, but at least I think that most of the people were traveling through Europe or other parts, because that was how the infrastructure worked at that time. And here we have just an example of one of those complex itineraries that the artists have to travel. So artists Celia Calderon and Elena Huerta, they traveled together, and they had to go from Mexico and then reach Switzerland when that was the point where they could actually get a visa to travel to the Soviet Union and to China later. And they travel, they in their memoirs, they give a recount of how difficult it was to get to China. And this was a common experience for many of the artists that travel. I also find relevant that they knew that going to China was dangerous, or was some risk that they had to take. And as this quote that I included here from Elena Huerta's memoirs, it says, taking a trip of this nature to China had consequences at work or in their positions. Only people convinced of socialist ideas dare to do it. So I think many of these artists reached China because of their political stances or like their political engagement, and they knew that there was some risk ongoing there, and they didn't know exactly what it was, you know, but they did feel the tension on taking this on this adventure. And then we see in this image Elena Huerta in Nanjing at the mausoleum of Sun Yat-sen. And to the right, we see another image of two Mexican artists that were a couple. Reina Lasso that we saw on the big video at the beginning, and Arturo Garcia Bustos. I had the privilege to meet them before they passed away recently, and interview them and talk about their experience of going to China. Also, they had a very different route, but then what they remember, what really resonated with them was more the traditions of China, or like the traditional architecture that they could see, and even like the Buddhist art that they saw. And here we see them in the caves in Yungan, and they were not the only ones going to these caves. Like mostly all Mexican artists, or also Latin American artists who went to China, were invited and to go to see these caves, or if they had more time, to go all the way to Dunhuan and the Silk Road and see the Buddhist arts, the Buddhist caves, that according to them and according to Venturelli, Jose Venturelli, who was the one that was giving them a lot of advice from China, they were the most impressive artworks that they could ever see in their life. And Siqueiros also talked very highly of these caves, the ones in Dunhuan, saying that those caves were the most important or the biggest example of public art in the world. Let me go to the next slide. So going back to this, the trip of Reina Lasso and Arturo Garcia Bustos, they also attended the same event that Orosco Rivera did in the Soviet Union in Moscow in 1957. But then they established connected with a different delegation. In this case, it was the North Korean delegation. They were, at that time, Reina Lasso was doing this painting that we see now on screen that is titled "We Will Win," and it does a comparison between North Korea and the coup d'etat in Guatemala, and in the middle we see the common enemy attacking both sides. In this case, it's a parachute attacking both parts of the world, both like Asia and also Latin America. And then I think it was amazing that she dared to travel with this large-scale painting all the way to first to the Soviet Union, and then because she was able to share this work in progress with other people, they were invited to go to North Korea so she could finish painting this artwork with looking at the landscape there and seeing what North Korea actually was. And once they were in North Korea, they also decided that why not going to China? It was an opportunity they couldn't not miss. So they took a normal, like a visa, like tourist visa. They did not get a official invitation from Chinese authorities, but they were able to go to China and also travel. Not as much as many other artists that were invited by the government, but at least they had this unique experience. Next slide, please. So I think for me, one of the big conclusions or insights that I have even while preparing this talk was that what actually brought these people to China was their political interests and the support for this new nation that they believe in. And even the artwork that they were doing previously to going to China had a very specific style that transformed after they went to China. And once they were in China, what actually caught most their attention were the traditions, were more like also the minority groups that they could see in China, and many other things that existed in China way before 1949. And I think that they also saw many similarities with the culture in Mexico, and they were inspired. I think both of these artists from these two very powerful cultures, they were influenced each other, but also were inspired and seeing, as Siqueiros was suggesting in his talks in China, seeing in their tradition a chance for building a new art, and being critical about their own traditions and seeing what part of them was a creative part, and how could they use it for continuing creating a new socialist art, but necessarily didn't align with the social realism that was coming from the Soviet Union. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're all back here. Well, I mean, that was incredible. That was just amazing, wonderful presentations, huge amount of new material. I think what we can do, obviously, this is such an unusual opportunity, and we've gone a little bit over time, but maybe we can take a few questions that we've gotten in the box. I think both Zheng and Marisol, you can see the questions in the box, and I will maybe take some questions that we have asked. But I just want to, as you're thinking about the questions in the box, and we can take 2 or 3 of them. And also, I encourage people who are still here, and there's 81 people still here, to ask questions, and we can always send them on if we don't get to them. So perhaps we can take 2 or 3 questions. But one of the things that you started out with, Marisol, and I think, Zheng, this would be a question for you as well, is why don't we know more about this story? Why did you in Mexico, Marisol, come upon this after meeting Zheng Shengtian and after going to Hangzhou? Obviously, the artists that you're talking about are extremely well known, whether it's Rivera or whether it's Orosco or whether it's Siqueiros. I mean, these are not unknown figures in the history of world art at some level. And yet you're saying that, this was a relatively new story for you. And Zheng, I mean, I would say that, from my perspective, my personal perspective, learning about Chinese art for almost 40 years, I mean, this certainly wasn't a story that I was taught in school, that I knew about. And, until you started spending a lot of time researching it, based on your personal experience, it's not a story that's really been told in the history books until very, very recently. So my question to you both is, why not? Marisol, you started the question. I'll ask you first.
Okay, yes, I think there might be many possible explanations. I will start from my own experience working in archives and seeing how the information about these exhibitions in China was treated. So many times when looking at the CVs of artists at archives, most of the information about China was very vague. No, it didn't really come with many details and or with accurate names. And I think first of all, maybe the language barrier was a reason why this wasn't very precise. So most of the time you have to kind of guess what things mean. What is this place name? They would just write something that they think it is, but they will never check. And then also the spelling will change later in time, So I think it was also for people that were creating these records, something very unknown. They just look at China or as a far away place or culture that they couldn't really get it completely right. It's okay, we'll just record something, but then they weren't as detailed record as many other events in other parts of the world, maybe in like other countries that had like Western language or like Romance languages or other languages that were more like commonly spoken in Mexico or by scholars. That could be one of the reasons. Very practical one, but there are many others, I think.
Zheng, what do you think? I mean, one of the issues that I find is that when people talk about the China during the what we call the Mao years, you know, from 49 to 76, you know, it's a period that is very uncomfortable, I think, for Westerners in some ways. They kind of ignore it or overlook it or dismiss it as, you know, a purely propagandistic period, and then kind of move on and become more interested after, you know, 76 and the fall of Mao. I mean, it's a period that just for various reasons and may not, it's just so different that it's hard for Western scholars to encourage. And also there's an issue around the archive and they're not that kind of materials and the willingness of people to talk about it. But why do you think?
Recently, you saw the Whitney Museum show, right? Unfortunately, I couldn't go because of the lockdown. But it was very exciting when I learned about the show. I read the curator's statement, especially this when she said that people think that 1930s American art was influenced from Europe, from Paris, but it's not true. Actually, American art was influenced by Mexican art. So this is I think this is a kind of a view we have been questioning for a long time in China, because the beginning of my research, I'm not a historian. Why I start to this is because I didn't read this in the official narrative of modern Chinese art history, but my personal experience told a different story. Because we are not only like the Chinese art that was after 1949 is completely followed the Soviet style. And then that continue is a mainstream already called the dominant, the kind of a orthodox style, you know, dominant Chinese education, art education, exhibition, artist practice until Cultural Revolution. But I find it was not true because I was a student at 50, I was teacher at 60s. We did have a different kind of approach, which in late last few years, I studied with, I was doing research on this Romanian art influence, like the artist called Eugene Popa, who come to Hangzhou to teach in 1960s. We have artists from other European countries, East Germany, or even Western European countries. Even they have very short visit, but they did show their work in China, like Italian artist Renato Cuduso, or many of those influences. It was not written in the mainstream art history. So I think now we try to picture what was going on during the socialist period of China since 1950s. I think there are a variety of artist practice and experiments, which actually gradually formed the foundation for contemporary Chinese art. So that was, I was doing this research in last more than 10 years. Is I tried to find that besides the socialist realism or this real revolutionary stuff, what else we we were learned from, like early the modernism, and then of course from Soviet Union, but then from Latin America, or even from other countries, from India or from Japan. I think we should rewrite the history which reflected the history, which not which will include all this experiment and the approaches by different artists in different locations. That's why I think why you say people didn't know this, because very few book about this. Until now, I didn't find any Chinese book, like a art history book, telling the story of this Chinese art exchange, not only with Mexico, but with other. I work with Asian art archive. I collect like hundreds of catalogs from exhibition of foreign artists, artists from foreign countries in 1950s, 1960s. Actually, all the shows, especially those important shows, they all left a marks in the development of Chinese art, but we didn't pay attention, or didn't spend enough time to look at this part of his history. So in the last few years, I work with some Chinese art historians, scholars in Beijing. We set up this project called Socialist Modernism. It means that in socialist China, we did have a continued kind of a study of modernism, but in a different, it's not exactly the same as the term modernism in the West. It's the Chinese artist who learned from Europe or from Latin America or from other countries, and tried to practice in their own way. And this kind of a record, I think, is very important for Chinese art history.
And also,
Please, Marisol, please.
yeah, no,
ahead.
if I, after hearing this, also made me think that in Mexico, we don't have any of those sort of books. It's not only from the Chinese part that these publications are missing. And even most of the books available in Mexico or in Spanish language about Chinese art are translations from English or from other languages, for French, German. That there hasn't been strong study of like Chinese art in itself from Mexico, from Latin America, and even less for these exchanges. And I think that also has to happen. Like these nations or these civilizations have to write their own histories. They don't have to rely on translations of the vision from another point of view. And I also was thinking another reason why probably these exchanges are not that well known has to do because of diplomatic reasons, and how at that time the People's Republic of China was not recognized by the Mexican government or many other governments in Latin America during the 50s. And at the same time that this Mexican art exhibition was happening, and it was touring around the Soviet bloc and also China, a similar exhibition around the same time was also organized by the Mexican government. And it was also promoting another type, like other vision of Mexico, and also from like a contemporary and other from similar artists. Some of the artists included were the same, others were different, but some of the artworks couldn't be repeated if they were original paintings. So this exhibition, for example, traveled to Japan. So it's how probably they're not that far in terms of the territory, but they were like just showing different images or representations of Mexican art to these two countries. And I think it's very important to emphasize that the Mexican exhibition that traveled to China was not sponsored at all by the government. It was sponsored by the governments of the countries that the exhibition visited. So they had to show that interest. And no longer after the exhibition, this group, the Mexican National Front of Plastic Arts, was dissolved too, because it was gaining a lot of power nationally.
Well, I mean, this is, all very fascinating, and I think we could probably go on all night. I really, it's incredible. I think one of my takeaways here is one of the goals of Asia Art Archive, but I think the goals of good researchers are to increase, to go back to the primary materials, build the archive, look at it carefully, and resist the urge to accept the mainstream, accept mainstream narratives, either because we're a little bit lazy, either because we're ideologically inclined to want to see that, or because it becomes very complicated if you don't. And I think the world is complicated. I think art developments are extremely complicated, and I think that's where the richness lies. But it's a challenge. I honor Zheng Shengtian for persevering to build the archive, and we're so honored as well to be the recipient of his incredible curiosity and energy. And so, these catalogs, these over 200 exhibition catalogs of foreign art in China during what we would call the Mao years, are at Zheng Shengtian's office in Vancouver, and he is digitizing them, and they are becoming available online for Asia Art Archive, because he puts them in the Dropbox and shares them with us as he finishes. So as well as myriad other pieces of documentation. Marisol, keep doing what you're doing. We want to stay in touch. We want to work together on this project. I'm sure, I thank Zheng Shengtian again for the introduction. I know that he, really respects your work and has enjoyed working with you. There are many questions still that are unanswered. What we will do, if you don't mind, is to the extent that you have given us your emails, which most of you have, we will send them on to both Zheng Shengtian and to Marisol, so that you can, when you have time, of course, and if you have answers or just want to respond or correspond, you are free to do that. And that way you will see what their questions are. Some of them are very, very specific, and some of them are really general, but all I can say is, to the extent that we're almost into 2 hours more, 2 hours now, and we've got, many people still listening and asking questions, is a testimony to how interesting and how rich and how important, how really important both of your research is. So thank you very much. I cringe at the thought of having to close this down, but I think we really have to. But Zheng Shengtian, Professor Zheng, thank you so much for everything that you've done for us and for the field, and for a richer and more layered and more nuanced understanding of the development of contemporary art. And Marisol, I encourage you to keep on keeping on, and I think that your PhD is going to be fabulous, and we look forward to reading it and seeing and hearing both. Maybe we get back together again and take this further. So thank you both very, very much, and thank you to the audience for listening and for all your questions. Good night.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.